I got the brief for the session, I thought, oh God, crisis, trouble. I haven't really delved into that too much. So I delved into the literature about crisis, disaster, hazards, and so on. And so I'll just share with you what I found. Periods of trouble, the title of this workshop, evokes a wide range of interpretations from the major ecological disasters, environmental hazards, like storms, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, avalanches, droughts, and mudslides, and so on, to historically structured processes such as migrations, urbanization, in more modern ways, colonialism, intermittent conflict with neighbors, evolving trade networks, and so on. So it's going from the really grand scale to the rather minute, as we've seen. Disasters, as we've heard before, they can be quite rapid events, or quite slowly developing processes that actually only show their occurrence much later. An example that's always loose in the literature is toxic spills. You only find out when you've got cancer half a century later that there might have been a problem. So disasters, hazards, periods of conflict, trouble, whatever you want to call them, they've been theorized by anthropologists and sociologists for decades, really. And obviously cultural change for archaeologists is at the very heart of our discipline. But this link specifically with disasters is something that I hadn't really come across as often. And quite interesting, I also thought, chiming with working on islands as laboratories and so on, to my surprise I was to learn as well that disaster researchers actually consider disasters a great thing because it reveals the sort of natural laboratories of how humans behave under quite stressful conditions. So, it's a great situation to be in, for them, that is, not for those who are affected. And going back to Oliver Smith, who's sort of been working in disasters for decades, I just found these definitions that I just thought I share with you. So he defines disasters as you can read, a combination of potentially destructive agents from the natural and/or technological environment and a population in a socially or technologically produced condition of environmental vulnerability. And obviously you can see he's placing a lot of emphasis on the environmental aspect rather than, I guess, as we archaeologists would face more on the sort of social side. And that, I guess, comes a little bit in the second quote where he says, disasters signal a society's failure to adapt successfully to certain features of its natural or socially constructed environment in a sustainable fashion. So a disaster is really only a disaster if it's perceived as such by the community. And obviously they're not just ecological events, but they ultimately arrive and originate from a social condition. And often I think what we've seen when we think about disasters in the ancient world is that they may originally affect all of the population, but they may only have possibly negative or positive effects for part of that population. So it's not the same. Not everybody will perceive a time of trouble in quite the same way. For sociologists, they have stressed the positive behaviors that a disaster, a time of trouble can actually lay bare, because it is a disaster enhances community morale, declines in crime and antisocial behavior, reduction in status differences, suspension of pre-disaster conflicts occur in the interest of community safety. And that may be the case immediately as disaster strikes, but they also emphasize that as soon as you're trying to start your recovery process, all this good behavior can actually go out of the window, and you're seeking advantages in your positioning. So individuals may seek long-term change, might actually welcome the destabilizing force of a disaster that now gives them the opportunity to bring forth that change that they wanted, because disasters generally are perceived to accelerate changes that were underway before the disaster already struck. And prudent players, for example, can take advantage of an uncertain situation and turn it to their advantage. At the same time, of course, a disaster is particularly tricky for those factions in society that are established, whose weaknesses are laid bare by the actual event and maybe by the lack of recovery after that. So in terms of disasters, if you're thinking about the grand scheme of disasters, I'm thinking about the fear and eruption, of course, which leaves major observable traces of that kind of time of trouble behind. But there are also other disasters that might go undetected archaeologically. Cohen put forward some suggestions of how we might think about these times of crisis. Obviously, because we can't detect them directly, there's no newspaper article saying there was a mudslide. But what kind of proxy criteria can we think about in order to determine times of crisis? And so he's proposing things like a spread of settlements into new ecological zones, the concentration on previously ignored micro-niches, change in the utilization of animal resources, in particular when you have previously use of large mammals maybe, and then you're moving to the smaller scales because you've depleted your supply. You might think about man-made environmental degradation and the decrease in size of shells or animals that you're consuming. So those are a lot of sort of proxies that are potentially available to us to think about crisis situations. And of course, when this kind of ecological information isn't available, we do, of course, have material culture, which has the potential, as we've seen today, to communicate the existence of times of stress. And I think any aspect of material culture, not just pottery, which is, of course, what we're focusing on, but any aspect can potentially reveal times of crisis, though I don't think it has to, but certainly there is a potential for it to do so. And obviously these kind of crises, these materials cultures, reveal sort of the underlying social relationships. In terms of pottery, I think it's fair to say that potentially any aspect of pottery can reveal times of crisis. So if you think about, we've talked about forming techniques, we've talked about decoration, we talked about firing, patterns and so on. Any aspect of the chaîne opératoire has that potential. And I think I want to just go back to something that Alexandra sort of hit on again this morning, which is a paper by Olivier Gosselin, where actually I think there's a differentiation made between the visibility of different trades in the chaîne opératoire and how they can be more obvious, and so therefore for us more easy to detect as scholars when we're thinking about times of crisis and change. And so we have the sort of the earlier version, I guess, of what you presented today. In that context, Olivier was talking about identity specifically rather than more broadly about interaction. But I think it's the same idea, so that you have techniques that leave visible traces on the finished product, which are then more superficial and easier to change. They're the ones that we would pick up more quickly. There might be things like secondary forming techniques, decoration motif, those kind of things that are easily seen when you're just, at the market. But then you have those that leave no visible traces behind, that might have to do with the production, where maybe only your fellow compatriots, fellow potters, family members, and so on might see that. And then finally is then those that don't leave any traces at all on the finished product, but are so influenced by your motor habits, by behavioral customs, that they are really difficult to change, and so therefore reflect kind of your most deeply ingrained identities. Now, in terms of these different options of, I think as Alessandro would call it, direct, casual, and mediated interaction, it's important to say that these kind of can act as signals and communicate a message about crisis or other kind of inferences, but sometimes they may be conscious, sometimes they may be unconscious, or I guess nowadays most scholars think of it as a combination of the two. What Giddens has called a practical consciousness, where you're somehow aware that you're communicating a message. You may not intentionally do so, but you kind of understand it at least when it happens. And I just want to talk about a couple of case studies that are not at all in the Cretan Greek world and so on. We're talking about Colombia, Ecuador in this case, where we're seeing this sort of emotion, the idea of crisis actually being picked up by pottery. And so this kind of practical consciousness is undoubtedly present among the women potters in Conambo in Ecuador. And it's one of the really good case studies, I think, by Bowser, where she's looking at the impact or how political alliances and crises within negotiations within a village are being played out actually in the pottery. So we have here the village of Conambo, and she's investigating the use of these chicha, these beer bowls, as you can see on the top right. And the designs are actually produced by the women who are the main potters in the community. And these beer bowls are, well, they're not public in terms of feasting outside and so on. They are domestic pottery. But the way negotiations are happening within the community is that people would, as individuals, come to different households, have their discussions, and meander through that village in order to come to some kind of consensus at the end. So it's a very personalized decision-making process. So these chicha bowls are what you would bring out as a guest arrives, and you would drink chicha beer in order, I guess, to smooth the discussions. So these bowls, they are a constant presence as people discuss their problems, as they're negotiating politics, as they're trying to come up with solutions for the community. And so what she has done is she compared the women's political affiliation, declared political affiliation, with the designs they've painted on the chicha bowls. And as you can see here at the bottom, let me just see if I can get this. She's used different variables and investigated to what degree they actually coincide with the women's political identity. And as you can see here, surprisingly, a very large number do. And what surprised her even more is that we always think that ethnicity might be something that overrules your sort of more modern, current political opinion. But no, it's only the interior framing that actually had the ethnic identity being more powerful in this relationship than the political one. So in addition to this, she also then asked the women to identify the political alliance of the different pots from the different potters. And the interesting thing is that in the large majority of cases, they were able to decipher these kind of messages quite accurately. So it was about 2/3 of the pots they were able to link them accurately to the correct political alliance. So here it's really quite nice to see that the painted designs reflect political alliances, and that these messages are conveyed through the designs, and in fact they're understood both by insiders of your alliance, but also by outsiders. Another example comes from Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico between the 12th and 14th centuries AD. You just see here the study area, but I'll go straight on. What you see here is the different time periods. So we're starting here in the late developmental period. You've got the sort of basic local pottery style. And then in this period, things change. And you suddenly see a lot of upheaval in that area. And you're moving then into the early and the late coalition phase, and I'll just move on to the next one to run through what this actually means. So you have the late developmental phase, where you have pottery production was widely dispersed among the hamlets in that region that you saw on the first map. The fabric analysis shows that the potters traveled great distances, and somebody's estimated in some cases they would travel up to 30 kilometers to get their tempering material in order to use what's been interpreted always the best, most suitable clay for the pot they wanted to produce. So you have widely distributed hamlets, wide range of mobility. People are traveling long distances, and that is displayed in the provenance analysis as well. So you can see that tempers reflect this heterogeneous sourcing, and that is reflected right directly in the chaîne laboratoire. So then moving on, do you remember this, we have this sort of migration phase. So suddenly population increases almost tenfold through migrations, people are coming in, and there is a time of real conflict and negotiation of space. And conflict seems to have accompanied these migrations. We have even examples of entire massacres uncovered in specific excavation settings. And these foreign potters, as you saw in the previous slide, they actually bring with them an entirely different style of pottery, which is a package that is coming along with these new potters. And as the new one comes in, you can see the old pottery style is kind of dying out. So what happens as this time of conflict kind of settles, a new pattern emerges, and that's what you can see here, is that people are actually now moving away from all the hamlets into one single large village in that region. And they're creating, in effect, a buffer zone between this one large village and then the next large village, which is in the next larger area. And what you can see in the pottery, again, that is being displayed directly in the pottery as well. So suddenly what you're seeing is that potters no longer have these, pottery no longer has this heterogeneous sourcing, but you now have very local clay and timber sources that are being used, regardless of whether they're the most suitable type for that clay or not. And mobility has been restricted quite dramatically, and estimates are to now within sort of 1 kilometer. So you can see that as a consequence directly, pottery morphology, fabric and style have all been shown to reflect the changes of the settlement structure on one hand, the population aggregation, but also the inter-village conflict as villages are trying to carve out their own sort of areas of authority. So again, another example of where pottery can actually contribute to us understanding these times of trouble. So while there's no doubt that times of crisis can manifest in aspects of material culture and beyond, there is no methodological reason to assume that all drastic changes observed in the archaeological record are the result of crisis. Changes in settlement patterns, population density, subsistent activities, technologies, and so on, can all take place without being preceded or instigated by a crisis. I would argue that material culture is constantly changing in response to multiple social or environmental triggers, most of which, depending on, I guess, our definition of crisis, we would not necessarily consider to be a crisis. So having sort of done this as a preamble, I now want to go to my case study, which is that at Phylakopi on Milos. And I think I'm continuing a little bit where Maria left off, I think, taking it into the next period as well. This looks a bit slightly blurred, but you can just about see. So Milos, and then Phylakopi is there. That's the site, settlement plan. And I won't bore you too much, but this is a nice summary, really, for those of you who aren't specialists in the area. So we're not concerned, really. We're starting with the sort of Middle Bronze Age and then upwards. And the key things, the reason I've picked this site is because there are two major crises, potentially crises, in that city. And one is when you have, at the end of your Middle Bronze Age, you have a leveling fill, which seems to be indicating that the entire town was kind of almost erased and a layer put down in order to then build your late Bronze Age town, which has a mansion that you can see on the bottom right, also a fortification. And then again, another crisis period is after that time period, as we're heading into the Mycenaean period, where you have the building of the Megaron, potential Mycenaean administrative structure. So that's kind of where the crisis comes in. Okay, let's just kick off straight away with that. Going back to the site, while I've chosen it, it's actually not the best site to choose in order to kind of demonstrate the crisis aspect, I think. Part of the reason is that the excavations, the original excavations, took place at the end of the 19th century, And the more recent excavations by Colin Renfrew, where you can see where you can see all the little trenches, that, as you can see, they are not connected. So the issue that I had when I'm looking at the pottery is that I can't really do a cross match between the different trenches, which undermines a little bit of what I'm trying to do. So the first step I had to take was actually to do a seriation study to bring it all in line, hopefully. The other reason is that when you look at the publication, is that scholars were obviously assigned different periods, which in itself is a problem, because obviously when they then see a fill that has been assigned to them, they will class it as either middle Cycladic or possibly late Cycladic 1, depending on which period they're kind of studying. So there are sort of minor issues with that. The third issue is that it's all very fragmentary, and really the only pots that are complete are my beloved conical cups, but they do get kind of boring after you've seen like a few hundred of them. So let's just run quickly through just to demonstrate that I've done the work and that you can hopefully rely on it. So seriation studies have been done to death on this site. The first one by Jack Davies and John Cherry. They didn't include the Middle Bronze Age, but I then sort of followed up and kind of repeated it with inclusion of the Middle Bronze Age and some other criteria. And you can see we've sort of created these battleship diagrams of how pottery develops through time, and so you can see the different criteria. They've long letters, so conical cups, plain pottery, bush slipped and burnished, and so on. And I've kind of had my own various categories as well, from burnished to conical cups to curvilinear motifs, Cycladic white, geometric, and so on. And so what we arrived at after all this kind of work is that we arrived at a comparison of the different trenches and kind of what time periods they cover. So I'll just skip over that. And Jack and John have nicely also then linked it with actual proper architectural stratigraphy, so to be sure that we're not randomly making things up. And they've compared it to, on one hand, the building of the fortification, which we know was kind of a relatively close contemporary event, but also the tephra fall from the Santorini eruption, and that's obviously very clear as it's a one-off event. So as long as they're roughly in the same area, we've kind of done an okay job. I then went a step further and decided, okay, I actually now need to think about each of the individual layers. And so I've done a correspondence analysis and looking at what actually goes together in terms of the different features that I've seen, different variables I picked. And what you can see, the black is the Middle Bronze Age, and then you've got the different phases in the Late Bronze Age, and these guys are outliers. They have a very high conical cup content, and they probably were sort of a single special fill, so I excluded them. I don't think it's worth lingering on that one. This is more important. Okay, so what transpires, I guess the one thing to say about the Middle Bronze Age is that we know both from the seriation, which is kind of all over the place, not very tightly clustered, but also from the actual study, that it looks like this was this fill. So we don't have any stratigraphy in the pottery to guide us through the different phases of the Middle Bronze Age. We can only do that in the late Cycladic phases. Okay. So let's come to the patterns that we've seen. So this is now, after all this work, this is the end result. It's a single table after all that. And you can see all the different variables that I sort of tabulated, and then what I've gone through is all the different time periods. And so I don't want to bore you too much, but I'll just run through the key characteristics of the late and middle periods. So late Middle Cycladic, you can see it's characterized by plenty of local burnished and slipped pottery. Cycladic white is still quite a dominant one. Cycladic white, just an example there. Barely any conical cups, which are the icon of Minoan civilization. And we do have a bit of imports from Kea, a little bit of grey minion. We heard about that one just from Maria before. And Middle Helladic imports have come as well. Middle Minoan imports, where are you guys here? They're just about 1%, and they make up quite a wide range chronologically as well, starting from about the Middle Minoan 2 period and then running into Middle Minoan 3b. And they're, comparatively speaking, numerous. Moving into the early Cycladic 1 phase, you can see that now we're seeing the big hitters coming in. The conical cup fabric starts really taking off. Where are you, conical cup? So from 0.3, we're going up to 5. We've got association with that, of course, the wheel. I'll talk about that in a moment. Burnished and slip, our favorite middle Cycladic styles, are going out of popularity. Middle and grey Minoan are still present, but in very small amounts. And we're having now late Minoan 1A imports coming in. The imports from the mainland are quite small still, but they're taking off in the next period. Middle Cycladic pattern just expands. Again, burnished and slip wears further decrease. Conical cup is the success story of the century. We're now up to 12%. And obviously wheel-made vessels are still very popular, roughly the same as before. Then moving into the late Cycladic period, we now have the conical cap fabric making up about 23%. And now you also see more and more of the local pottery being made on the wheel. Burnished and slipped have virtually disappeared, and other imports are reduced quite dramatically. But instead, what we're seeing is that the Mycenaeans are starting to come in at this point. So that's kind of the big change that you see. In terms of motifs, I didn't have a table for that. Just to let you know that in terms of the motifs, the bracket pattern was very characteristic for the Middle Cycladic. It continues. And we do have new ones coming in as well, like tortoiseshell, ripple, a spiral, and reed patterns, and so on. Another table, I'm afraid. In terms of forming techniques, this is my long table. So anything that is in bold is Minoan-inspired pottery style. Anything just in plain is a local design. And again, you can see from the Middle Cycladic period, the vast majority of pottery is made by hand. The only ones that aren't are related to the Minoan network. And then as you're going through the early, middle, and then into the late Cycladic time period, you can see that gradually more and more of the Minoan ones are following in the wheel shape and the wheel making mode, but also that you're now seeing maybe some local ones heading into wheel direction. And here's just a visualization of the gradual increase in wheel making pots, certainly in the Minoan world, but also gradually the locals kind of buy into this trend, but not quite as enthusiastically, I should say, as for the Minoan periods. Then let's look at my favorite conical cups, these chaps over here. So I've done this investigation into how standardized they are. And I guess the reason really was to see whether it was a change in pottery production through time. So what I did is I analyzed the pots, and you can see Phylakopi pots, the rim diameters, or in this case, the height. And you can see between late Cycladic 1 and late Cycladic 2, I don't have examples for the Middle Bronze Age. You can see that they are alike. They are the same, not broken yet. They are the same, and they're not changing over time. Whereas if you were to compare it to Kea, so where you have Iorini, and I'm not sure you can actually see that very well, you can see that there is no change in Phylakopi in the height, the rim diameter, base diameter, or body thickness. No change at all between those two time periods. Whereas in Kea, Iorini, you see that between those time periods, you go from an unstandardized and non-standardized setup to a standardized setup over time. So there seems to be a change in the pottery production. It's been interpreted by the people who did the cane investigation as a drive towards more efficiency in order to increase your competitiveness in the market. While I don't think that is necessarily the case, I think what I want to hammer home is that we are seeing this lack of change in production at Phylakopi here for the pottery production. So what does that all kind of add up to? So the stratigraphic and architectural information available from Phylakopi shows two major disruptions in the settlement's life. The first can be dated to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, when the site was leveled in its entirety and rebuilt in the late Cycladic I period with a fortification and the mansion. And the second one, as I said, is at the beginning of the late Cycladic III period. Different causes have been proposed for this major destruction at the end of the Middle Cycladic period. The original excavators assumed that it was due to an earthquake damage. However, Renfrew, in his excavations, is slightly less specific, and he simply talks about destructions. The existence of a major leveling episode could equally be interpreted as a necessity following an earthquake destruction, or as an independent major rebuilding project by the local community. In either case, it could signal a time of crisis, either crisis as a result of natural disaster, or crisis as a result of social and political renegotiation among the inhabitants. The construction of the mansion, a central building with evidence of potential administrative function related to potentially linear A, on top of the leveling layer, would at first glance favor the second alternative and may indicate the emergence of a new ruling elite. Having said that, we have also seen in our discussion about disaster more broadly that these events can often act as a catalyst for the emergence of new power players who may have been lying in wait and waiting for this opportunity to arise. So an earthquake could have afforded the necessary trigger by undermining existing power structures, questioning existing cosmologies, and highlighting the benefits of a newly emerging elite. Regardless of the cause, the action, that is, of leveling the entire town, must have represented a time of heightened stress for all inhabitants concerned. So turning now to our ceramic evidence, let's see whether we can see any of this crisis reflected in the pottery. And as you can see with a quick glance, no, you can't. Where there's gradual change through time, burnishing, slipwares are slowly waning, Cycladic white is gradually becoming less important, Minoanizing shapes and motifs are gradually increasing. It's a gradual change. It's not an abrupt emergence or disappearance of aspects. So I think from that perspective, certainly, we do not pick up this hiatus in the pottery. Instead, what is visible is a continuation from the Middle Cycladic into the late Cycladic I period. This is not to say there was no conflict, quite possibly to the contrary, but I think this conflict was one between those who were deeply wedded to the local tradition and wanted to continue producing pots in the established ways, rather than one of a bigger scale. So if we're thinking about what I said before, that most pottery shapes were wheel-made in the Minoan style. So here an example. So you've got, again, all the different pottery types. Those are underlined, are Minoan designs. Those aren't, are sort of local designs. And then here you can see, sorry, that's quite poor. You can see the different fabrics and which ones are wheel-made and which ones aren't. And you can see this one here is the conical cup fabric. You can see that throughout time, it is always the most frequently wheel-made fabric. And the other ones are kind of waxing and waning, but broadly speaking, they're on the increase. What is interesting when you look at this development in terms of wheel throwing, wheel making, you see that what the locals did is they picked up the Minoan package. So when they introduced the wheel throwing, they didn't just select the technique, but they selected the entire pottery package. So It would be, the shapes would be Minoan shapes. The fabric would be Minoan imitating fabric, even to the extent where they would put on a slip in order to make it pale, which is the Cretan kind of fabric, in order to disguise the local slightly crappy orangey red fabric. The forming technique would be wheel-made, and any of motifs, Minoan motifs, would be always used on Minoan kind of designs. And that is in contrast to the local tradition, which continues to use the local shapes with a local fabric, with a local forming technique, which is handmade, and local motifs. So you're seeing this quite big contrast, this kind of conflict within a community, which is probably not a crisis in the sense that it's a bigger environmental event, but I think it's a small crisis in the community where there clearly are different factions vying for attention. So how has this been explained? So I think it is a conceptual division between those who are in effect supporting Minoan practices, Minoan designs, Minoan styles of fashion, and a tradition of the locals who are hesitant to give up that tradition that they have experienced. So I think we're looking at a conflict, a conceptual division in that community. This conceptual division is, for example, not present at other sites like Aierini, where they went wholesale into the adoption of Minoan shapes and the wheel-throwing techniques. So taking that all together, pottery, like any other item of material culture, has the ability to communicate messages about cultural norms, political alliances, and religious beliefs. This can be particularly marked in times of crisis, when traditions are contested, old ways of life challenged, and new alliances created. As societies are ever changing and adapting, change in ceramics is not limited to or is even more pronounced during times of crisis, but is a natural process at sometimes rapid, sometimes slower speed. As I've shown throughout the talk, the major period of upheaval in Phylakopi can be dated to the end of the Middle Cycladic period, when the town was entirely rebuilt. Despite this, the pottery production points to a gradual development, with trends uninterruptedly continuing from the Middle Cycladic period into late Cycladic I. Whatever the cause of the destruction, be it the earthquake or a political power struggle, this event did not lead to any major changes in the ceramic tradition. Instead, the rise of Minoan pottery was already firmly established in the Middle Bronze Age, but gathered greater speed in late Cycladic as import decreased and local production of Minoanizing shapes filled the gap. It is only in the forming techniques, which Gosselin has argued represent the most rooted aspects of an individual's identity, that we see an emerging social conflict between those who treasure the tradition and those who wanted to associate themselves with a new, culturally perceived to be superior lifestyle. Thank you.